when I talk and when Amy talks tomorrow about individualism, this is the deep commitment of individualism, which is at the core of modernity, where the self displaces God at the center of moral meaning. I'm citing a number of writers here to just get some flavor for the kind of the spirit of modernity, the spirit of modern culture. I have cited a couple times Craig Gay, whose book is on your list, The Way of the Modern World, Why It's Tempting to Live as If God Doesn't Exist, a wonderful book. And Gay observes early in the book that there are two great commitments that characterize the modern notion of progress: scientific advancement, and, quote, and scientific advancement means more control over nature, and, quote, the liberation of individuals from the repressive constraints of religion and tradition. Progress requires more knowledge about stuff that we can do, and it requires the elimination of constraints from individuals of religion and tradition. And both of these result in the mastery or the rational control of the whole world. Albert Borgman, a philosopher who's dedicated his life to thinking and writing about ways in which technology affects our thinking about and our engaging creation. He has argued that the modern project is characterized by three interlocking themes: the domination of nature, the primacy of method, and that's obscure and I'll explain it in a minute, and third, the sovereignty of the individual. So the control of nature and the sovereignty of the individual both co-op. By this second point, the primacy of method, he's suggesting that in modern philosophy, beginning with René Descartes in the 17th century, that modern philosophy is more interested in constructing satisfactory mental theories than with actually describing the nature of things. Borgman later calls this a triumph of procedure over substance. And we could say that a lot of our culture is a triumph of procedure over substance. The primacy of method is a sentiment that allows bureaucracies to be regarded as more real and more important than individuals. It encourages us to be more interested in our means than our ends, fascinated with the functioning of our tools more than we are with the actual achievements made possible by our tools. There are some interesting resonances between Descartes' commitment to method and the rather arcane financial instruments that contributed to the recent crash, derivatives, which apparently no one really understood. Political philosopher Patrick Deneen observed on his blog last fall that at nearly every level, this financial collapse was precipitated by transforming reality into abstraction, unmooring grounded commitments and obligations, and fostering new patterns of fantastical behavior throughout the populace. That's all related to Borgman's idea of the primacy of method. Now, as modernity made the self the center of the moral universe, rather than natural law or cosmic law or divine purpose, it also effected a change in understanding about the nature of the cosmos. What kind of world do we live in? The radical anthropocentrism, man-centeredness of modernity, is linked to the assumption that the universe is made up of inherently impersonal, meaningless stuff. You can't get wisdom from looking at hyssop, would be a modern assertion. The universe is just raw material for projects of human devising. It's mathematically decipherable, but it's morally and spiritually mute. The more rationalizable the world becomes in our understanding, the more disenchanted it is, or as physicist Steven Weinberg observes in his book, The First 3 Minutes, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. That's an important part of the trajectory of modernity, and it's the meaninglessness of creation itself. Part of this story in modernity has to do with how philosophers and scientists understood our perception of the physical world, and over time, our perception of the physical world and our internal world were increasingly separated. And nature was eventually perceived as just a great machine made of dead matter. It was fun you could understand it mathematically. It functioned mechanistically. It didn't have any purpose, any end. But understanding those mathematical or mechanistic rules, you could do a lot of cool things. As one writer has written, this way of understanding created some formidable philosophical problems, but it provided a conceptual framework for spectacular advances in the sciences. And this writer, Franklin Baumer, says, with the elimination of what have been called the secondary qualities, that is, how we actually perceive the world in color and smell and sound and taste, nature inevitably began to seem less like the setting for man's spiritual pilgrimage and more like a field for the exercise of human power. But where this was understood, it prompted on the whole more optimism than pessimism. If we want to change the world, we can. We just have to think we can. Pre-modern men and women lived in a world that was often threatening and baffling, but it was full of purpose and meaning, however obscure and mysterious. Modern men and women live in a world that is meaningless, but more and more manageable, more and more subjected to our wills through science, technology, and the concentration of economic power. Modernity bargains away meaning for power. There's still the possibility of meaning for modern people, but it's private meaning. It's interior. It's not tied to the cosmos in any way. Now, before we look at how modern economics is typically modern, I want to mention a few other characteristic aspects of modernity that flow from these undergirding themes of the nature of nature and human nature. Actually, I'll just focus on one, the idea of freedom. The reason freedom is so central in modern Western thought is because the human will is assumed to be the most fundamental human attribute. Modern culture understands freedom quite differently from classical and pre-modern Christian culture. And this idea of freedom informs free market theory. David Bentley Hart recently noted that the pre-modern Western understanding of freedom was inseparable from an understanding of human nature. To be free was to be able to flourish as the kind of being one was, so as to attain the good towards which one's nature was oriented. That is, human excellence, charity, the contemplation of God, and so on. To choose awry, to choose badly, through ignorance or malfeasance or corrupt longing, was not considered a manifestation of freedom, but of slavery to the imperfect, the deficient, the privative, and the literally subhuman. So freedom was not just a matter of unlimited choices. Freedom was escaping the slavery of disordered desires. That's very different from a modern understanding. If there's no natural or divine law, if there is no chief end of man that exists prior to our choosing, then freedom has to be understood as an unlimited power of choice. On the modern view, there are no limits to freedom or power over nature built into human identity. That is, there's no exercise of freedom or power that would be intrinsically out of keeping with the kinds of creatures we are or with the nature of nature, since nature has no nature. And since the kinds of creatures we are is finally willing creatures, creatures who make things happen. That's what makes us most important, who want things. Now, on this understanding, and for some other reasons, there's a deeply Gnostic flavor to modern thought. You know, the ancient Gnostics denied the goodness of the material world and tended to deny the reality of the incarnation. There's not much room in modern thought for accounting for the moral meaning of bodies or embodiment, nor for social patterns tied to our embodiment. So the importance of the extended family, for instance, or the idea that human sexuality is objectively meaningful, or the links between sex and love and marriage and fidelity, or the significance of place in a well-lived human life. All of these consequences of embodiment are negotiable when willing becomes the most dominant human attribute. Now, from the time, at least the time of Hobbes in the 17th century, it became evident that a society of sovereign selves, people who were essentially engines of desire and will, that would require a very powerful central authority in the state.